Dr. Quan Deho walked through the marble halls of Nexus Academy with purpose. His tall, thin frame moved with the careful grace that marked his species. The Veltharians were known across the galaxy for their cold logic and perfect planning. They had won more wars than any other race because they never made mistakes. Today felt different, though. Today, Deho would begin studying something that puzzled him greatly. The morning light from Kepler 442b's twin suns filled the Academy's great library. Students from dozens of different worlds sat at floating desks, their various forms bent over holographic displays. Some had 6 arms, others breathed methane, and a few existed as pure energy. But they all shared one thing. They were here to learn about war. Professor Deho, called a familiar voice. Commander Yu Jin'e approached with a data pad in her 4-fingered hands. She was younger than Deho, but just as sharp. Her silver eyes held the same calculating look that all Veltharians wore when thinking about military problems. "The human files you requested," Jin'e said, handing him the pad. "Though I must ask again, why study such a primitive species? They only discovered faster than light travel 50 years ago. Their weapons are crude, their ships are slow, and their military thinking is—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Chaotic." Deho took the pad and smiled slightly. It was not a warm smile. Veltharians did not feel warmth the way other species did. It was a smile of curiosity, like a scientist who had found an interesting specimen. "That chaos interests me," he said. "The Galactic Council will vote on human membership next year. We need to understand what kind of warriors they are." Jin'e tilted her head. "Surely that's obvious. They're weak. Their application shows they've been fighting wars on their home planet for thousands of years. Any truly advanced species would have solved conflict long ago through proper planning and resource management." "Perhaps," Deho said, but something in the preliminary reports had caught his attention. Human wars followed no logical pattern. They won battles they should have lost and lost battles they should have won. It made no sense. The 2 Veltharians made their way to Deho's private study. The room was exactly what one would expect from his species: clean, organized, and efficient. Holographic displays showed star maps and tactical formations. Books lined the walls, each one perfectly aligned. Deho activated his main display and began scrolling through human military history. The first entries made him laugh, if Veltharians could truly laugh. Humans hitting each other with sticks and stones, riding animals into battle, using metal swords when energy weapons existed elsewhere in the galaxy. "Look at this," he said to Jin'e. They had something called the Battle of Marathon. A few thousand humans defeated a much larger Persian army by running at them. Just running. No advanced tactics, no superior weapons. They simply ran faster than their enemies expected. Jin'e shook her head. Primitive luck, but Deho kept reading. The more he learned, the more confused he became. Humans seemed to fight best when they were losing. At a place called Thermopylae, 300 warriors held off hundreds of thousands of enemies. They knew they would die, yet they fought anyway. "This makes no sense," Deho muttered. "Why fight when you know you cannot win? Any logical species would surrender and preserve their lives for a better opportunity." "Maybe they're just stupid," Jin'e suggested. A soft chime indicated someone was requesting entry. "Come in," Deho called. The door slid open to reveal Ambassador Park Hyunwoo, humanity's representative to the Academy. He was a middle-aged human with graying hair and kind eyes. Unlike the other species at Nexus Academy, humans looked remarkably similar to several other races: 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head. But there was something in their eyes that seemed different. "Professor Deho," Park said with a slight bow, "I heard you were studying our military history. I thought you might have questions." "Many questions," Deho replied. "Your species' approach to warfare is unusual." Park smiled. It was a genuine smile, full of warmth that made Deho slightly uncomfortable. Veltharians did not understand such displays of emotion. "I suppose it might seem strange to other species," Park said. "We've been told we're rather emotional compared to most galactic civilizations." "Emotional." Deho repeated the word like he was tasting something foreign. "Yes, that appears to be accurate. Tell me, Ambassador, why did your people fight at Thermopylae? They knew they would lose." Park's expression grew serious. "They fought because it was right. Because sometimes winning isn't about surviving. It's about making sure the next battle can be won." Jin'e made a sound of confusion. "That is illogical. If you die, you cannot fight the next battle." "No," Park agreed. But your sacrifice might give others the chance to fight that battle. The 300 at Thermopylae bought time for the rest of Greece to prepare. Their deaths saved thousands of lives. Deho felt something he had never experienced before, a small chill of unease. He pushed the feeling aside and returned to his datapad. "I've been reading about your world wars," he said. "Such massive conflicts over resources that could have been shared through negotiation." Park nodded sadly. "Humans aren't always rational, Professor. We feel strongly about things like freedom and justice. Sometimes we feel so strongly that we're willing to die for these ideas." "Die for ideas," Jenny whispered. "How wasteful, is it?" Park asked. "Those deaths led to technologies that eventually brought us to the stars. Our conflicts taught us lessons we couldn't have learned any other way." After Park left, Deho and Ginny sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Ginny spoke. "They're dangerous," she said quietly. "How can they be dangerous?" Deho asked. "They're technologically inferior to most council species." "That's exactly why they're dangerous," Ginny replied. "A logical species we can predict. We can calculate their moves, plan counters to their strategies. But humans, how do you fight an enemy that doesn't care if they die?" Deho looked back at his display. The human military record stretched back thousands of years, filled with battles that made no logical sense. Wars fought over ideas rather than resources. Soldiers who charged certain death because they believed it was right. For the first time in his long career studying warfare, Deho felt uncertain. He was beginning to understand that he wasn't just studying human military tactics. He was studying something far more complex and frightening. He was studying the human soul. Outside his window, the twin suns of Kepler 442b began to set. Tomorrow he would dive deeper into human warfare. Tonight, though, he found himself troubled by questions he had never considered before. What happened when logic met pure emotion on the battlefield? What happened when calculated strategy faced passionate desperation? Deho was about to find out. 3 weeks had passed since Deho began his study of human warfare. His office now looked very different from its usual perfect order. Holographic displays covered every wall, showing battle maps, casualty reports, and tactical analyses. Books about human history lay scattered across his desk, something that would have horrified him a month ago. Ginny entered the room carrying a steaming cup of the bitter tea their species preferred. She stopped short when she saw her mentor hunched over his desk, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. "Professor, when did you last sleep?" she asked. Deho looked up with tired eyes.
"Sleep is inefficient right now."
"I'm discovering patterns in human warfare that should not exist." He gestured to a display showing casualty statistics. "Look at this data from their Second World War. At a place called Stalingrad, the humans defended a single city for 5 months. The logical action would have been to abandon the city and regroup elsewhere. Instead, they fought for every building, every room, every staircase." Ginny studied the numbers. "The casualties are enormous. Both sides lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers." "Exactly," Deho said, his voice growing excited. "Any rational species would have calculated the cost and withdrawn. But the humans kept fighting. And here's what disturbs me. They won. How is that possible?" Deho pulled up another display. The attacking force was technologically superior and had more soldiers. By every mathematical model we use to predict battle outcomes, they should have taken the city in weeks. But the humans turned the city itself into a weapon. He showed her images of the destroyed city. Buildings had been converted into fortresses. Every pile of rubble became a defensive position. Humans had fought in sewers, basements, and destroyed factories. They made their enemy pay for every meter of ground. Deho continued. The attackers won most of the individual battles, but the cost was so high that they could not continue the war effectively. Ginny shook her head. "This contradicts basic military theory. You preserve your forces to fight another day." "That's what any logical species would do," Deho agreed. "But humans seem to operate on different principles. They calculate not just the cost to themselves, but the cost to their enemies." Over the following days, Deho discovered more examples that troubled him. At a place called the Alamo, fewer than 200 humans held off thousands of attackers. They knew they could not win, yet they fought until every defender was dead. Why? He asked Ambassador Park during their daily meetings. Why not surrender and live to fight when the odds were better? Park considered the question carefully. Because surrender wasn't really an option. Not when the stakes were so high. What stakes could be worth certain death? Freedom, Park said simply. The right to choose our own path. The defenders at the Alamo bought time for others to organize resistance. Their deaths inspired thousands to join the fight. Deho felt that strange chill again. You're saying they died to send a message? In a way, yes. They showed that some things are worth dying for. That message was more powerful than any weapon. That night, Deho couldn't focus on his research. He kept thinking about the concept of dying for ideas. His species had conquered half the galaxy through careful planning and superior technology. They won wars by being smarter and better prepared than their enemies. But what if they faced an enemy that didn't care about being smart? What if they fought humans who valued ideas more than their own lives? Ginny found him staring out the window at the stars. You're troubled, she observed. I'm beginning to understand something terrible, Deho said. We've been studying warfare all wrong. What do you mean? We assume that all species fight to win. But humans don't just fight to win. They fight to make their enemies lose, even if it costs them everything. He turned back to his displays and pulled up records from human naval warfare. Look at this battle from their Pacific War. Human pilots deliberately crashed their aircraft into enemy ships. They turned themselves into weapons. Ginny studied the data with growing alarm. They killed themselves to damage the enemy? Not just damage, terrorize. Imagine being a soldier knowing that your enemies might throw themselves at you without warning. How do you defend against someone who treats their own life as ammunition? The more Deho learned, the more disturbed he became. Humans had developed warfare tactics that were mathematically impossible to defend against. How do you calculate odds when your enemy includes their own deaths as acceptable costs? He found records of human resistance fighters who operated behind enemy lines during their world wars. When captured, they often chose torture and death over revealing information. Some even killed themselves to protect their allies. This is madness, Ginny said after reviewing the files. No rational being would choose such suffering. That's exactly the point, Deho replied. Humans aren't always rational. They're driven by emotions we don't understand: loyalty, honor, love of freedom. These emotions make them unpredictable. He showed her data from human guerrilla campaigns. Small groups of humans had defeated much larger, better-equipped armies by using tactics that defied conventional military wisdom. They hide among civilian populations. They strike without warning, then disappear. They turn every citizen into a potential threat, Deho explained. How do you conquer a planet where every inhabitant might be a soldier? Ginny was quiet for a long moment. You're saying humans have developed a form of warfare that cannot be countered through traditional means? Worse, Deho said. I'm saying they've developed a form of warfare that gets stronger when they're losing. He pulled up tactical analyses showing how human resistance movements had grown during occupations. The more pressure applied, the fiercer the resistance became. Look at this pattern, he said. Every time humans are conquered or oppressed, their resistance increases exponentially. It's as if suffering makes them stronger. Ambassador Park arrived for their afternoon meeting to find both Veltharians staring at him with expressions of barely concealed fear. Is everything all right? Park asked. Ambassador, Deho said carefully, I need to ask you something important. If Earth were invaded by a superior force, what would humans do? Park's expression hardened. We would fight, even if you could not win. Especially if we could not win. But why? What would be the point of resisting if victory was impossible? Park smiled, but it wasn't the warm smile Deho had grown accustomed to. This smile was cold and dangerous. Professor, you're thinking about this wrong. Victory isn't always about who's left standing at the end. Sometimes victory is about making sure your enemy regrets ever starting the fight. After Park left, Deho and Ginny sat in silence. Finally, Ginny spoke. We need to recommend against human membership in the council. Why? Because, Ginny said quietly, they're the most dangerous species we've ever encountered. Not because they're strong, but because they're willing to lose everything to make their enemies pay. Deho nodded slowly, but deep in his mind another thought was forming. A thought that terrified him even more than human military tactics. What if the humans already knew how dangerous they were? What if their application for council membership wasn't a request for protection, but a warning? Outside, the twin suns were setting again. Tomorrow, Deho would dig deeper into human military psychology. Tonight, he wondered if he was studying an enemy or learning to become one. Deho had not left his office in 3 days. Ginny brought him food, but most of it sat untouched. His normally precise appearance had deteriorated. His clothing was wrinkled, his silver hair unkempt. For a Veltharian, this was shocking behavior. Professor, you must rest, Janae pleaded. Your research is consuming you. Deho looked up from his latest discovery with wild eyes. Rest? How can I rest when I've found something that changes everything we know about warfare? He gestured frantically at his displays. I've been studying what humans call their last stands, battles where they had no hope of survival yet fought anyway. The data is impossible, Jenny. Impossible. On the main screen, casualty reports from dozens of human battles scrolled past. At a place called Rourke's Drift, 150 humans held off 4,000 attackers. At the Battle of Saragossa, civilians, including children, fought alongside soldiers against Napoleon's army. Look at this pattern, Deho said, highlighting sections of data. Every time humans face overwhelming odds, their fighting effectiveness increases, not decreases, increases. This violates every principle of combat psychology we know. Janae studied the numbers with growing unease. Their casualties are always enormous. Yes, but so are the casualties they inflict on their enemies. A force of 300 humans at Thermopylae killed thousands before being overwhelmed. The mathematical ratio is absurd. Deho pulled up another file. And here, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Humans trapped in a walled section of a city, facing certain death, fought for nearly a month against a technologically superior enemy. They had no heavy weapons, limited ammunition, and no hope of rescue. Did they win? They lost, Deho said quietly. But they made their enemies pay such a terrible price that similar uprisings broke out across their planet. Defeat became victory through inspiration. A soft chime announced Ambassador Park's arrival. The human entered to find both Veltharians staring at him with expressions of fascination and horror. Good morning, Park said cheerfully, then paused when he saw their faces. Is something wrong? Ambassador, Deho said carefully, I need to understand something about human psychology. When your people face certain death, why do they fight harder instead of seeking survival? Park's expression grew thoughtful. That's a complex question, Professor. May I ask what specific examples you're studying? Deho showed him the data on human last stands. Park nodded as he reviewed each battle. These weren't meaningless sacrifices, Park explained. Each of these defeats served a larger purpose. The Spartans at Thermopylae bought time for Greece to unite against invasion. The defenders of the Alamo inspired Texas to fight for independence. The Warsaw fighters showed the world that the human spirit could not be broken. But they all died, Janae pointed out. Yes, Park agreed. But their deaths had meaning. They chose how to die, and in doing so, they chose how to live forever in memory. Deho felt his worldview cracking. You're saying humans can find victory in defeat? Sometimes defeat is victory, Professor. Sometimes losing a battle wins a war. After Park left, Deho threw himself back into his research with renewed intensity. He began studying what humans called honor, a concept that seemed to drive many of their military decisions. Look at this, he told Genie, displaying records from human military academies. They have codes of conduct that require them to fight even when retreat would be logical. They call it honor. That's irrational. Exactly, Deho exclaimed. And that irrationality makes them unpredictable. How do you plan a campaign against an enemy whose decisions aren't based on logic? He found records of human soldiers who had thrown themselves on explosives to save their comrades. Others who had refused to abandon wounded allies even at the cost of their own lives. They prioritized the group over the individual, he realized. But not in the way our military manuals describe. This isn't about preserving maximum fighting strength. It's about something else entirely. Days passed as Deho dove deeper into human military culture. He discovered concepts like leave no one behind and death before dishonor. Ideas that made no tactical sense but seemed to drive human behavior in combat. Jin-ai, he said one morning, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. I think I understand why humans fight the way they do. Tell me, they're not fighting for resources or territory or even survival. They're fighting for ideas, abstract concepts that exist only in their minds but drive them to acts of incredible courage or terrible vengeance. He pulled up a new display showing human psychological profiles. A Veltharian soldier fights because it's logical, to protect resources, territory, or genetic lines. But a human soldier fights for freedom, justice, honor, love. These things have no physical form, yet humans will die for them. Jin-A looked disturbed. You're saying they're willing to fight and die for things that don't actually exist? Worse, Deho said. I'm saying they fight harder for these imaginary concepts than most species fight for their own survival. He showed her records from human resistance movements during their world wars. Humans had endured torture, starvation, and death rather than betray their beliefs. Look at these interrogation records, he said. Captured humans often chose death over compromising their principles. They valued their ideas more than their lives. That's insane, is it? Deho asked. Or is it the most sophisticated form of warfare ever developed? Over the following week, Deho began to see human military history in a new light. Every defeat contained the seeds of future victory. Every sacrifice inspired others to fight harder. They've weaponized their own deaths, he realized with growing horror. Human casualties don't just damage their military capacity, they strengthen their resolve. He found records of human military ceremonies honoring their dead. Elaborate rituals that turned fallen soldiers into symbols of inspiration. Other species mourn their losses, he told Jin. Humans celebrate them. They turn death into motivation for the living. What kind of species does that? A species that understands something we don't, Deho replied. They know that some victories can only be won through sacrifice. Ambassador Park found them both staring at displays, showing human memorial sites, massive structures dedicated to honoring war. Dead Professor, Park said gently. You look exhausted. Perhaps you should take a break from this research. I can't stop, Deho said. I'm beginning to understand that humans have developed a form of warfare that transcends physical reality. You fight with ideas, emotions, and symbols as much as with weapons. Park nodded slowly. You're starting to understand us. I'm starting to fear you, Deho admitted. Park's expression grew serious. Good. That means you're taking us seriously. After the ambassador left, Deho and Jin sat in uncomfortable silence. Finally, Jeannie spoke. What are you going to recommend to the council? Deho stared at his data for a long moment. I don't know. How do you evaluate a species that treats death as a tactical option? How do you predict the behavior of beings who value ideas more than survival? Maybe we shouldn't, Jin said quietly. Maybe some species are too dangerous to understand. But Deho couldn't stop. Deep in his mind, a terrible thought was growing. What if studying human warfare was changing him? What if understanding their psychology was making him think like them? For the first time in his life, Deho was beginning to understand what humans called fear. Deho's office had become a maze of holographic displays and scattered research materials. The once pristine workspace now looked like the command center of a species at war. Jinny had stopped trying to maintain order, focusing instead on keeping her mentor from complete mental collapse. Professor, the Academy Council has sent 3 messages asking about your progress report, she said, placing another untouched meal on his desk. Deho didn't look up from his latest simulation. Tell them I need more time. I'm testing human strategies against our standard military doctrines, and the results are... He paused, searching for words. Disturbing. On his main display, a tactical simulation played out. Veltharian forces, superior in every measurable way, engaged human defenders. The simulation ran dozens of scenarios, each with the same impossible outcome. The humans lose every individual battle, Deho muttered. But they win the war, every single time. Jin studied the results. How is that possible? Their technology is inferior, their numbers smaller, their tactics chaotic. That's exactly why they win, Deho said, his voice taking on an edge of hysteria. Our tactics assume rational behavior, but humans aren't rational. Watch this. He replayed a simulation where human forces were completely surrounded. Standard military doctrine predicted immediate surrender to preserve lives for future battles. Instead, the simulated humans fought until completely destroyed, but inflicted such heavy casualties that the Veltharian force was too damaged to continue their campaign. They turn every defeat into a Pyrrhic victory for their enemies, Deho explained. How do you maintain a military campaign when every battle, even every victory, costs you more than you can afford? Ginny felt a chill run down her spine. You're saying they've found a way to win by losing? I'm saying they've found a way to make winning meaningless for their enemies. A new message appeared on Deho's communication panel. Captain Lee Soo-jin, a human military officer assigned to the Academy's exchange program, requested a meeting. Deho accepted immediately. When Captain Lee arrived, Deho was struck by how ordinary she appeared. Medium height, dark hair, unremarkable features. Nothing about her suggested the terrifying military mind he had been studying. "Professor Deho," she said with a respectful bow, "Ambassador Park mentioned you've been studying our military history. I thought you might have questions about modern human military doctrine." "Many questions," Deho said, gesturing for her to sit. "Captain, I've been analyzing your species' approach to warfare, and I must admit I find it deeply troubling." Lee raised an eyebrow. "Troubling how? Your people seem to fight most effectively when facing certain death. This contradicts every principle of military psychology we know." Lee smiled, the same warm, dangerous smile Deho had learned to fear from humans. "Perhaps your principles are incomplete, Professor." "Help me understand," Deho said desperately. "Why do humans fight harder when they're losing?" "Because losing isn't the worst thing that can happen to us," Lee replied simply. "What could be worse than death?" Lee's expression grew serious. "Living with the knowledge that we didn't try. Living with shame. Living in a world where our children can't be free." Deho felt his understanding of warfare crumbling. "You're saying there are things worse than extinction?" "Absolutely. Slavery is worse than death. Dishonor is worse than death. Watching our children grow up in chains is worse than death." Janae leaned forward. "But if you're dead, you can't protect anyone." "No," Lee agreed. "But if we fight hard enough, if we make our enemies pay a terrible price, maybe they'll think twice before threatening someone else's children." Deho pulled up his tactical displays. "Captain, I'm going to show you some scenarios. I want you to tell me how humans would respond." The first scenario showed Earth facing invasion by a technologically superior force. Standard doctrine suggested negotiated surrender to preserve the population. Lee studied the display for a moment. "We would fight, even knowing you would lose?" "Especially knowing we would lose. But why? What would be the strategic value?" Lee's smile turned cold. "Professor, you're still thinking about this wrong. The strategic value isn't in our survival. It's in making sure our enemies regret attacking us." She gestured to the tactical display. "If someone invades Earth, we won't just fight them in space or on the ground. We'll turn the entire planet into a weapon." Deho felt his throat constrict. "What do you mean?" "Every city becomes a fortress. Every civilian becomes a potential combatant. Every mountain, forest, and desert becomes a place where invaders die. We'll make them fight for every meter of ground, and we'll make sure that even if they win, they're too damaged to enjoy their victory." Janae made a sound of horror. "You would sacrifice your entire planet?" "If necessary," Lee said calmly. "Better to die free than live as slaves." Deho ran more simulations, each one more horrifying than the last. In every scenario where humans faced extinction, they responded by ensuring their enemies faced destruction as, well, "You've weaponized desperation," he whispered. "We've learned that sometimes the only way to win is to make winning too expensive for your enemy," Lee corrected. She showed them human military manuals describing scorched earth tactics, strategies designed to deny resources to occupying forces even at the cost of the defender's own civilization. "If someone conquers human territory, they inherit ruins, not riches," she explained. "We make sure that victory is more costly than defeat." Deho's hands were shaking as he entered new parameters into his simulation. "What about nuclear weapons?" "I've read about your doctrine of mutually assured destruction." Lee nodded grimly. "If someone threatens to destroy us, we guarantee to destroy them in return. Even if we all die, even if the planet becomes uninhabitable, we make sure our enemies die with us." "That's insane," Janae breathed. "That's effective," Lee replied. "How many species do you know that would attack someone willing to commit mutual suicide?" The simulation results appeared on Deho's display, and he nearly fell from his chair. In every scenario where humans faced total annihilation, they responded with total war, not just against their enemies' military forces, but against their entire civilization. "You don't just fight to win," he realized with growing horror. "You fight to make sure that even if you lose, your enemies lose everything too." "Now you're beginning to understand us," Lee said. After the captain left, Deho and Janae sat in stunned silence. Finally, Janae spoke. "They're not just dangerous, they're completely insane." "No," Deho said quietly. "They're the most terrifyingly sane species I've ever encountered. They've solved the fundamental problem of warfare." "What problem?" "How to make aggression unprofitable. If you know that attacking humans will cost you everything even if you win, why would you attack them at all? Daiho stared at his displays, seeing human military doctrine in a new light. It wasn't about winning battles. It was about making war itself too costly for anyone to consider. They've turned warfare into a suicide pact, he whispered. Attack us and we all die together. Jinei was quiet for a long moment. What are you going to tell the council? Daiho looked at the data one more time. Humans had created a form of warfare that made victory meaningless and defeat a form of vengeance. They had weaponized their own willingness to die. I'm going to tell them, he said slowly, that we've encountered something unprecedented, a species that fights hardest when they're losing and considers mutual destruction a viable military strategy. Will you recommend them for council membership? Daiho laughed, a sound no Veltharian had ever made before. It was not a happy laugh. Jinei, I'm beginning to think the real question isn't whether we should accept humans into the council. The question is whether we can afford not to. Outside his window, the stars seemed different now. Somewhere among them was a blue planet full of beings who had turned desperation into their greatest weapon, and Daiho was beginning to understand that studying them had changed him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The Academy's medical staff had been called to Daiho's office twice in the past week. Jinei watched her mentor with growing alarm as he pushed his body and mind beyond all Veltharian limits. His silver skin had taken on an unhealthy pale tone and his eyes held a wild look that no member of their species should possess. Professor, you must stop, she pleaded. This research is destroying you. Daiho looked up from his latest discovery with eyes that seemed to see too much. Stop? How can I stop when I've found the answer to the universe's greatest military question? His office had become a monument to human warfare. Every wall displayed battle statistics, psychological profiles, and tactical analyses. In the center of it all sat a single chair where Daiho spent his days and nights, trying to understand the incomprehensible. What question? Jinei asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. How to fight a war where your enemy considers death a viable strategy, Daiho said, gesturing wildly at his displays. Do you understand what that means? Every military doctrine in the galaxy assumes that all species want to survive, but humans have transcended that limitation. On his main screen, the final results of his comprehensive analysis scrolled endlessly. Thousands of human battles, each one defying logical military principles. The pattern was undeniable and terrifying. They've discovered something we never even considered, Daiho continued. That willingness to die can be more powerful than any weapon. A soft chime announced another visitor. Colonel Kim Tae-hyung, one of humanity's most decorated Special Forces officers, had requested an emergency meeting. Jinei had tried to refuse, but Daiho insisted on seeing him. When Kim entered, Jinei was struck by how calm he appeared. Unlike Captain Lee's obvious military bearing, Kim moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen too much combat and lived to analyze it. Professor Daiho, Kim said with a slight bow, I understand you've been conducting an extensive study of human military capabilities. Yes, Daiho said, his voice cracking slightly. And I must ask you something that has been troubling me. Why do humans speak of their defeats as victories? Kim considered the question carefully. Perhaps because you're misunderstanding what victory means to us. Explain. Kim gestured to one of Daiho's displays showing the Battle of Thermopylae. You see this as a defeat because the Spartans died. We see it as a victory because their sacrifice saved Greece. But they're dead, Jinei protested. Their bodies died, Kim agreed, but their example lived forever. Sometimes the greatest victory is showing others that resistance is possible. Daiho leaned forward desperately. Colonel, I need to understand human psychology. What drives a species to choose certain death over possible survival? Kim's expression grew serious. Professor, may I ask why this matters so much to you? Because, Daiho said, his voice barely above a whisper, the Galactic Council will vote on human membership soon, and I don't know what to tell them. What specifically concerns you? Daiho activated his tactical simulations. This. Watch what happens when I run standard invasion scenarios against human-defended worlds. The simulation played out on the main display. A technologically superior force attacked a human colony. Standard doctrine predicted swift victory with minimal casualties. Instead, the attackers found themselves facing an impossible nightmare. The humans don't just fight, Daiho explained frantically. They turn their entire civilization into a weapon. Civilians become combatants. Infrastructure becomes traps. Children are taught to build explosives from household items. Kim nodded calmly. Asymmetric warfare. We learned from our own history that overwhelming force can be defeated by sufficient determination. But the cost, Jin-A said, horrified by the casualty projections. Your own losses would be enormous. Yes, Kim agreed. But our enemy's losses would be total. Daeho ran another simulation, this time showing a full-scale invasion of Earth itself. The results made him physically ill. According to this analysis, he said, his hands shaking, humans would sacrifice their entire planet rather than surrender. You would turn Earth into a graveyard that consumes any invasion force. If necessary, Kim said simply. Why? Daeho screamed, his composure finally breaking completely. Why would any species choose extinction over slavery? Kim's answer was quiet but absolute. Because some things are worse than death, Professor. And because if we fight hard enough, if we make the cost high enough, maybe no one will ever again think it's worth attacking someone who can't defend themselves. The conversation that followed would haunt Daeho for the rest of his life. Kim described human military doctrine with the casual professionalism of someone discussing weather patterns. Scorched earth tactics that would render entire worlds uninhabitable. Guerrilla strategies that could turn any occupation into a nightmare of endless casualties. Chemical and biological weapons held in reserve for use against anyone who threatened human extinction. You're describing the most sophisticated form of military deterrence ever conceived, Daeho realized. You've made yourselves too dangerous to attack. That's the idea, Kim confirmed. But the most chilling revelation came when Kim discussed human space military doctrine. In the event of existential threat, human fleets wouldn't just fight enemy ships. They would target enemy homeworlds, civilian populations, and industrial infrastructure. Total war, Kim explained. If someone threatens to exterminate humanity, we guarantee to exterminate them in return. Even if it means the destruction of entire civilizations. Jin-A made a sound of absolute horror. You would commit genocide? To prevent our own genocide? Yes, Kim said without hesitation. We've learned that the only way to stop monsters is to become something they fear more than death. After Kim left, Daeho collapsed into his chair, his mind reeling from the implications of what he had learned. Humans had created the ultimate military doctrine, not one designed to win wars, but one designed to make war itself too costly to contemplate. They've solved it, he whispered to Jin-A. They've actually solved the problem of warfare. What do you mean? They've made themselves so dangerous that attacking them is essentially suicide. Who would risk total annihilation for any conceivable gain? Daeho stared at his final analysis, a comprehensive report that would determine humanity's place in galactic civilization. The numbers were clear and terrifying. Humans represented the most dangerous military force in known space, not because of their technology or numbers, but because of their psychology. What are you going to recommend? Jin-A asked. Daeho looked at the data one last time. Humans had weaponized their own willingness to die. They had turned desperation into strategy and sacrifice into strength. Most terrifying of all, they had proven that sometimes the greatest victory came through mutual destruction. I'm going to recommend immediate and unconditional alliance, he said finally. What? Don't you see? Daeho laughed that horrible, un-Veltharian laugh again. They're not just dangerous as enemies. They're invaluable as allies. Who would attack the Galactic Council if it included a species willing to commit mutual suicide, rather than surrender? Jin-A understood then what had broken her mentor's mind. Daeho hadn't just studied human warfare. He had learned to think like a human. And thinking like a human had taught him something that no Veltharian should know. Sometimes the only way to guarantee peace was to promise total war. As Daeho prepared his final report, he realized that studying human warfare had changed him forever. He had discovered a new kind of fear, not the fear of death, but the fear of an enemy who embraced death as a strategy. And deep in his transformed mind, a small voice whispered the most terrifying truth of all. He was beginning to understand why humans fought the way they did. He was beginning to think it made sense.